And our first graduate student is Megan Lauber, and she received her bachelor's degree from University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is currently a graduate student in Dr. Paul Fricke's lab at University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she is working on optimizing reproductive protocols while using sex semen. And today, Megan will be presenting on the effect of timing of induction of ovulation relative to timed AI, using sex semen on pregnancy outcomes of primiparous Holstein cows. So please welcome Megan Lauber from the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the introduction and the committee and the sponsors for this great opportunity. So if we start here, my mouse will let me. There we go. If we take a look here at the inseminations in our Holstein females, this is our lactating dairy cows and heifers, we've seen a dramatic change in our mating strategies on farm. So here on our y-axis, we have our inseminations as a percent, and on the x, we have our years. The blue is our beef conventional semen, the red is our Holstein conventional semen, and the green is our Holstein sex semen. As you can see, from about 2017 to 2020, we've seen an increase in the amount of sex semen and beef semen being used in the dairy industry. And it's interesting, a large proportion actually of the sex semen being used in our Holstein seems to be more attributed now that increase to more sex semen in our lactating dairy cows, thanks to the further development and the adoption of high fertility programs. But regardless, it's interesting to see how sex semen and beef semen are really being used hand in hand for dairy producers to implement more precision management. So using that sex semen to create the genetically elite replacements while using beef semen on our lower genetic merit animals to increase the market value of those cull calves by creating dairy beef crosses. But for our herds to utilize and maximize the use of precision management, there's still kind of an elephant in the room that we have sex semen conception rates that are 75 to 90% of that of using conventional semen. So it's really challenging for our dairy producers to maximize this precision management if we're not maximizing for our fertility with sex semen. And so with sex semen, a challenge with that, with the sperm of sex semen, is that these sperm undergo quite a bit more extensive processing, that these sperms seem to be more damaged. And an interesting idea to combat this fertility or this damage is to inseminate sperm at a different time, potentially closer to the time of ovulation, to help hopefully improve fertility. So an interesting observational study that kind of looked at this for context, looked at the timing of insemination with cows reaching activity threshold or the onset of estrus with sex semen and our lactating Jersey cows. So what they did is they synchronized cows for estrus at about 39 days of milk, gave a treatment of prostaglandin, then put cows with heat detection collars, and then at a voluntary waiting period of 50 days in milk, they then received another treatment of prostaglandin, and cows were estrus detection and inseminated based off that treatment. If they weren't inseminated from the prior one, given another treatment of prostaglandin, and they had subsequent pregnancy checks at about day 31 and day 66 after estrus detection and AI. And if we kind of look at the results of this study, here on the Y, we have our pregnancies per AI as a percent, and on the X, we have our days after estrus detection and AI. About day 31, our first check, and day 66, our pregnancy recheck. The colors and the columns indicate our timing of insemination relative to the onset of activity or estrus. So cows inseminated less than or equal to 3 hours after the onset of estrus are in the blue, 4 to 12 in the orange, 13 to 22 in the green, the yellow is 23 to 41, and the red is greater than or equal to 42. And it's interesting, this observational study observed a tendency that cows inseminated 13 to 22 and 23 to 41 hours after the onset of estrus had increased pregnancies per AI than those inseminated earlier or those inseminated later. So kind of an interesting parameter that way. So it's kind of a new and interesting idea that inseminating later relative to the onset of activity or estrus will lead to increased fertility with sex semen. But this may be the case when inseminating cows in this manner based on estrus, but as we know, there's a lot of variability to estrus of when cows come into estrus and that interval from the onset of estrus to ovulation. And it's hard because this hasn't really been tested in something that's more controlled, like a synchronized breeding protocol in which timing of ovulation is precisely controlled. So our objective with this study, kind of to bring this home as the context, is to do this in a more controlled manner with a synchronized breeding protocol where we control the timing of ovulation. So a brief overview of our farms. We had 3 locations of farms that participated where first lactation only cows were enrolled. And of these cows, they were submitted for first time AI using a Double-Ovsynch protocol. And then they were inseminated with sex semen at timed AI. If we look specifically at these protocols, here we have our standard double-Ovsynch protocol. And if we look closer at our last GnRH, G2, this induces ovulation before timed AI. Generally, G2 is given in the PM or approximately 16 hours before timed AI. So we'll denote this group as G216, and this will always be in blue. Whereas our treatment, it was a modified double-Ovsynch protocol in which, again, timed AI is consistent across our treatments. So this occurred as well in the AM as our previous group, our control. It was at the same time, timed AI across the groups. About what we changed in this to modify this is that we changed induction of ovulation. So this G2 was moved from the PM into the AM. So we're having earlier induction of ovulation to inseminate cows later or closer to the time of ovulation. So we'll denote this group as G224, and that's in the red. And if we look at the results of this, the effect of treatment on pregnancy outcomes, here on the y-axis, we have our pregnancies per AI as a percent. And on the x, we have our days after timed AI. So our first check at about day 34 and our recheck at about day 80. Again, the blue is our control at G216, and the red is our G224, cows inseminated later. And it's interesting, across our pregnancy checks, we see a 6 percentage point and a 7 percentage point respective decrease in pregnancies per AI when we have earlier induction of ovulation to inseminate cows later or closer to the time of ovulation, which is quite a bit different than the estrus data I kind of previously showed you to kind of set our seed. But regardless of our treatments, we still see about 90% females, which is what we'd expect when we have such a high skewed X sperm population that we're inseminating these cows with. So what factors are affecting fertility? So time for sperm transport and capacitation is something that we alter in this study, where our G216 cows that control had about 8 to 16 hours versus our G224 cows, which had about 0 to 8, which for the bovine, it's been suggested that sustained transport requires about 8 to 12 hours. Time for luteolysis, so these G224 cows had about 8 fewer hours than our G216 cows, which affects our different hormonal concentrations, such as our progesterone, as well as our estradiol, because we slightly alter that ovulatory follicle size. So G224 cows likely ovulated smaller follicles because they had 8 fewer hours to develop during that synchronized follicular wave. So if we kind of compare this to some literature that is available on timing of insemination, this study was one of the first to address this question, and this was looking at it with conventional semen. So here on the y-axis, we have our conception rate or pregnancies per AI. On the X, we have our hours after our second GnRH injection. And similar to our study as well, when timed AI occurred about 16 hours after a GnRH treatment, they saw the greatest pregnancies per AI versus those that were inseminated about 24 hours. They saw, again, a decrease in pregnancies per AI, not quite to the extent we did, but again, following that similar trend. In a more recent study, looking at this timing of insemination question in heifers, this group randomized heifers to different semen types, either conventional semen, sex semen where they were early or at a standard time point, or sex semen late. So briefly, these heifers were synchronized using a 5-day cedar sync protocol, in which at day -3, heifers had a cedar removed and given a treatment of prostaglandin. And then from there, they had twice daily estrus detection. That conventional semen group and that sex semen early group had scheduled timed AI for day 0. But if they came into estrus prior to that, they received insemination at their estrus detection versus our sex semen late group in the study that they did. They had a timed AI scheduled at day 0.5. And if those came into estrus prior to that scheduled timed AI, they were not inseminated at their estrus detection, but the subsequent estrus detection by that group. And so it's interesting when we look at the fertility differences here, we have our conventional semen and our sex, either early or late. It's actually interesting, we don't see a difference when we delay timing of insemination with sex semen in this heifer population as well. So kind of an interesting comparison. And it's interesting to see too that we still, even when we have heifers randomized, that this conventional semen still outperforms our sex semen almost about 20 percentage points. So we still have quite a bit of a difference in fertility with our conventional versus our sexed. But the sex semen, again, still offers that benefit of producing about 90% females, fetuses, versus those of our conventional, about 43%. So our pregnancies per AI of sex semen that they observed in the study was about 69% of that, a conventional semen. So like I mentioned earlier, we still subsequently see decreased fertility with sex semen, and that's something we need to address. And in more of a cow focus, this was looking at a similar design in seasonal calving pasture-based Irish Friesian cows. So again, these cows, similar to that heifer study, were randomized to treatment type, either a conventional semen, sex semen at a standard timing, or a sex semen late group. So here, if we look at this, they were synchronized with a PRID sync, similar to a cedar sync. And each group, this conventional and this sex semen standard or sex semen 16, received their GnRH treatment on day -1 in the PM and had subsequent time to I about 16 hours after that treatment, versus the sex semen 22, which is kind of a late group. They had their GnRH treatment on the same day, again, day -1, but time to AI occurred 22 hours after that treatment, so delaying timing of AI. And it's interesting when we look at these results that here on the Y, we have our pregnancies per AI, and on the X, we have our treatments. The green is the conventional. The blue is the sex semen 16-hour time to AI, and the red is our sex semen 22 or sex semen time to AI at 22 hours. And similar to that heifer study, we actually don't see an increase nor a decrease in fertility when we alter the timing of insemination with sex semen. But again, to reiterate, it's more the difference that we see in our fertility between our conventional semen versus our sexed. So quite a bit of a difference. If we look at that fertility of that sex semen relative to our conventional, this is about 80% relative to our conventional for our 16-hour time to AI versus 84% for our sex semen 22 time to AI group, was about 84% relative to conventional. So in conclusion, delaying insemination using sex semen relative to earlier induction of ovulation in a synchronized ovulation protocol decreased fertility in our primiparous or first lactation Holstein cows. So it seems to be more important to inseminate at the correct time relative to ovulation when using sex semen to increase the amount of pregnancies reproduced and therefore the amount of heifers. So hopefully I left them a little bit of time for questions, and if somebody has any, I'd love to take those. So
you are welcome to type in the questions on the chat, and we can get to those if you type them in. Otherwise, Megan's email address was listed there, so you can just email her any questions that you have. And thank you so much for going through that. A lot of information really quickly and really thoroughly. So thank you so much.